My divorce lawyer says I'm already married to someone I've never met. Rebecca Thornton sat across from me in her downtown office and repeated the statement for the third time because I'd gone completely silent after the second. I'd hired her 6 weeks ago to handle what should have been a straightforward divorce from my wife, Olivia, after 3 years of marriage that had deteriorated into bitter silence and separate bedrooms. Rebecca had filed the initial paperwork, served Olivia, and scheduled mediation for property division. Everything was proceeding normally until yesterday when the county clerk's office flagged my marriage license application from 2019 as invalid. Rebecca pulled out a manila folder and extracted a document I'd never seen before. A marriage certificate dated March 15th, 2011, registered in Clark County, Nevada, showing my signature next to someone named Yesenia Cortez. The certificate had my correct social security number, my correct birth date, and a signature that looked disturbingly similar to my actual handwriting. I'd never been to Las Vegas in March 2011. I'd been finishing my junior year at Ohio State University, working part-time at a campus bookstore, and dating someone named Amanda, who I'd eventually break up with that summer. I told Rebecca this was obviously identity theft or fraud, that someone had stolen my information and used it to create a fake marriage certificate. She nodded, but her expression suggested the situation was more complicated than simple fraud. I thought the same thing initially, Rebecca said, but I've spent the last 24 hours investigating, and the marriage appears legally valid in every technical sense. It was registered with Nevada's Bureau of Vital Statistics. Both parties signed in the presence of a licensed officiant. Witnesses were present and signed. The officiant's license was active and legitimate. From a legal standpoint, this marriage exists, which means your 2019 marriage to Olivia is technically void. The implications hit me immediately. I'd been living with someone I thought was my wife for 3 years, but legally we'd never been married. Every joint financial decision, every insurance policy, every legal document we'd signed as spouses was now questionable. I asked Rebecca how this was possible, how a completely fraudulent marriage could appear legitimate to every authority. She explained that marriage fraud was more common than most people realized, particularly in Nevada, where couples could marry with minimal identification and no waiting period. The state's verification systems checked that documents looked properly formatted and that social security numbers passed basic validity tests. They didn't typically verify that the person signing was actually the person named on the certificate. Someone had obtained my personal information, traveled to Las Vegas, and convinced an officiant they were me. They'd brought another person who pretended to be willing to marry them. They'd signed documents, paid fees, and created a legally binding marriage that existed in state databases and federal records. The question was why someone would go to that effort, and who was Yesenia Cortez? I asked Rebecca if she'd located this woman, and she said she'd been trying. There were 47 women named Yesenia Cortez in the United States, according to preliminary searches, but none matched the birth date or social security number listed on the marriage certificate. That information appeared to be fraudulent as well. Rebecca had hired a private investigator named Dennis Carver, who specialized in identity fraud cases. He'd been working since yesterday afternoon to trace Yesenia Cortez and understand what had happened in March 2011. I felt rage building because whoever had done this had stolen 12 years of my life, in a sense. They'd created a legal entanglement that now prevented me from divorcing Olivia and moving forward. I'd have to spend money and time untangling a marriage I'd never been part of before I could end a marriage I desperately wanted to escape. Rebecca's phone rang and she answered, listened for a moment, then asked the caller to hold. She told me it was Dennis with an update and asked if I wanted him to come to the office to brief us both. I agreed immediately because I needed answers more than I needed anything else. Dennis arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a tablet and a folder full of documents. He was in his 50s, formerly with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, now working private investigations. He sat down and pulled up a photograph on his tablet, showing a Nevada marriage certificate identical to the one Rebecca had received from the county clerk. But Dennis had obtained this copy directly from the Clark County Clerk's office in Las Vegas, along with supporting documentation. "The marriage is real," Dennis said without preamble. March 15th, 2011, at the Little White Chapel on Las Vegas Boulevard. The officiant was a woman named Carol Jensen, who's been performing weddings there for 30 years. I spoke with her by phone an hour ago. She has no specific memory of this wedding because she performs about 400 weddings per year, but her records show she officiated this ceremony. The witnesses were 2 employees of the chapel who signed dozens of marriage certificates that day. I asked if there was any video footage or photographs from the ceremony. Dennis shook his head and explained that the Little White Chapel didn't keep video archives from 12 years ago, and most couples purchased photo packages that were delivered within weeks, then purged from the system. There was no visual record of who'd actually stood in that chapel claiming to be me and Yesenia Cortez. Dennis continued his briefing by explaining that he'd traced the social security number listed for Yesenia Cortez. It belonged to a real person, but not someone named Yesenia. The number was issued to a woman named Barbara Fields, who died in 2009 at age 83 in Florida. Someone had stolen a deceased woman's social security number and attached it to the fake identity of Yesenia Cortez. The fact that both parties in the marriage were using fraudulent or stolen identities suggested this wasn't a random crime of opportunity. Someone had carefully planned this fake marriage for a specific purpose. Dennis had theories about what that purpose might be. Identity fraud marriages are typically used for one of four reasons, Dennis explained. Immigration fraud, where someone needs a marriage to a U.S. citizen to obtain a green card. Financial fraud, where someone wants access to benefits or credit using a spousal relationship. Legal protection, where someone wants to avoid testifying against an accomplice by claiming spousal privilege. Or strategic fraud, where creating a prior marriage prevents someone from legally marrying their actual partner. The fourth category caught my attention because it applied directly to my situation. Someone had created a fake marriage using my identity in 2011, and that fake marriage had lain dormant for 8 years until I tried to marry Olivia in 2019. But the state hadn't flagged it then, only now when we tried to divorce. I asked why the fraudulent marriage hadn't been detected when I applied for my marriage license to Olivia. Dennis explained that most states didn't run comprehensive checks for prior marriages at the time of application. They relied on applicants truthfully declaring their marital status. The fraud only surfaced now because divorce proceedings required more thorough verification to ensure the marriage being dissolved was valid. The timing suggested whoever created the fake marriage might not have intended for it to interfere with my real marriage to Olivia. They'd created it for some other purpose entirely, and its interference now was an unintended consequence that had triggered this investigation. Dennis believed if we could understand the original purpose, we'd identify who was behind the fraud. Rebecca asked Dennis what he recommended as next steps. He said we needed to file an annulment petition in Nevada claiming the marriage was fraudulent, while simultaneously working to identify who had actually participated in the ceremony. He'd submitted information requests to financial institutions and government agencies that might have records showing Yesenia Cortez as a beneficiary or claimant anywhere. If the fake identity had been used to collect benefits, apply for credit, or conduct transactions, there would be a trail. He also planned to interview Carol Jensen in person in Las Vegas to see if showing her photographs might trigger any memories about the ceremony. I agreed to pay for Dennis's continued investigation and Rebecca's work on the annulment. I also needed to tell Olivia what was happening, because this affected her status as well. We weren't legally married, which meant she had no legal claim to any assets we'd accumulated together. That might actually work in my favor during property division, but it also meant she'd been living in legal limbo for 3 years. I called Olivia that evening and asked if we could meet. She'd been staying with her sister since I filed for divorce and was reluctant to see me, but when I explained the situation was urgent and affected her legal status, she agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop. When I explained what Rebecca had discovered, Olivia's reaction was immediate disbelief, followed by accusation. She said I was making up an absurd story to avoid paying her what she deserved in the divorce, that I'd probably orchestrated the fake marriage myself years ago for tax purposes or some other scheme, and now it had backfired. I showed her copies of the marriage certificate and Dennis's preliminary findings. She read through everything silently, and I watched her expression shift from skepticism to confusion to anger. Not anger at me for once, but anger at the situation and whoever had created it. She asked what this meant for her legally. I told her the truth, that our marriage had never been valid, that she had no legal claim as a spouse, but that I'd still honor our original separation agreement because the invalid marriage wasn't her fault. Olivia shook her head and said she didn't trust me to honor anything without legal enforcement. She'd be getting her own lawyer to protect her interests. I expected that response and didn't blame her. Our relationship had deteriorated to the point where neither of us trusted the other's word. She left the coffee shop without another word, and I sat there processing how much more complicated this situation had become. I had 2 legal battles now, annulling a fraudulent marriage to a stranger and negotiating a settlement with someone I'd lived with for 3 years but had never technically married. The next day, Rebecca filed the annulment petition in Clark County, Nevada, arguing that the marriage was void ab initio because it had been entered into through fraud and false pretenses. The petition required serving notice to Yesenia Cortez at any known address, but since we had no valid address for a person who might not exist, Rebecca asked the court to allow service by publication in Nevada newspapers. The judge granted the motion and set a hearing for 6 weeks from the date of filing. During those 6 weeks, Dennis continued his investigation and uncovered information that transformed the case from simple identity fraud into something much darker. He found that my social security number had been used to apply for credit cards in 2011, shortly after the fake marriage. The applications listed Yesenia Cortez as an authorized user. The cards had been used to make purchases totaling about $50,000 before the accounts went into default. Collection agencies had tried to pursue payment, but had been unable to locate either me or Yesenia. The defaulted debt had appeared on credit reports associated with my social security number, but I'd never seen it because I'd had credit monitoring services that had somehow missed or filtered these accounts. Dennis believed the credit fraud was the original purpose of the fake marriage. Someone had wanted to link 2 identities together to create authorized user relationships that would allow them to run up debt under my information. But when Dennis traced where the credit card purchases had been made, he found something unexpected. Most of the charges were at stores and restaurants in Columbus, Ohio, the city where I'd been living and attending college in 2011. Whoever had used those credit cards had been physically near me at the time, spending money in the same area where I lived and worked. That proximity felt threatening because it suggested the person who stole my identity had been watching me somehow, had known my location and routine. Dennis pulled transaction records and found charges at specific restaurants I'd frequented during college, at bookstores near campus, at gas stations I'd used regularly. The person using my stolen identity hadn't just known my personal information. They'd known my physical location and habits. They'd been following me or surveilling me in some way. Dennis showed me a map plotting all the credit card transactions from 2011. They clustered around Ohio State's campus and the apartment where I'd lived with 2 roommates. Several charges were at stores within walking distance of my home. I felt violated understanding that someone had been that close to me, tracking my movements, stealing my mail, or accessing my information somehow. Dennis asked if I remembered anything suspicious from 2011. Any break-ins at my apartment, any missing mail, any sense of being watched. I thought back 12 years trying to remember details from a period of my life that had felt completely normal at the time. I'd been 21 years old, focused on classes and work and social life. I hadn't been paying attention to potential threats. Then I remembered something that might be relevant. In February 2011, about a month before the fake marriage, my apartment had been broken into while my roommates and I were at class. We'd reported it to police, but nothing obvious had been stolen. The burglars had gone through our belongings but had left electronics and valuables. At the time, we'd assumed we'd interrupted them or they hadn't found anything worth taking. But what if they hadn't been looking for physical items? What if they'd been looking for documents, identification, personal information? I told Dennis about the break-in, and he immediately requested the police report from Columbus PD. The report confirmed what I remembered. Forced entry through a window, rooms searched but nothing reported stolen, no suspects identified, case closed as unsolved burglary. Dennis believed this break-in was when my identification documents had been stolen or at least photographed. Someone had broken in specifically to gather information needed to steal my identity. Then they'd traveled to Las Vegas a month later and gotten married using my information. They'd returned to Columbus and used credit cards linked to that marriage to make purchases. The whole operation had been carefully planned and executed by someone who'd targeted me specifically. Dennis asked why someone would target a random college student for identity theft. Usually these crimes focused on people with good credit scores and high incomes who could support large fraudulent charges. I'd been 21 with minimal credit history and a part-time bookstore job. I wasn't a lucrative target, unless the targeting wasn't random, unless someone had chosen me specifically for reasons unrelated to financial gain. I asked Dennis if there was any way to identify who'd actually signed the marriage certificate. He said he'd been working on that and had made progress. The signature on the certificate claiming to be mine was similar to my actual signature, but had subtle differences that a forensic document examiner might be able to identify as coming from a different person. Dennis had hired an examiner who'd analyzed the signature and concluded it was a deliberate forgery, created by someone who'd seen my real signature and practiced copying it. More useful was the second signature, the one claiming to be Yesenia Cortez. That signature was in the state's database, and Dennis had been running it through comparison software looking for matches to other documents. He'd found something unexpected. The same handwriting appeared on a name change petition filed in Ohio in 2010. A woman named Diana Ruiz had petitioned to legally change her name to Yesenia Cortez, and the signature on that petition matched the signature on my marriage certificate. Dennis had tracked Diana Ruiz back through public records and found her current location. She was living in Cleveland under her original name, Diana Ruiz, apparently having abandoned the Yesenia Cortez identity shortly after the fake marriage. Dennis had her current address and suggested we contact her immediately to understand her role in the fraud. Rebecca agreed and said we needed Diana's testimony for the annulment hearing. If she could confirm the marriage was fraudulent and explain who'd paid or coerced her into participating, we'd have the evidence needed to void the marriage and potentially pursue criminal charges. Dennis made the call to Diana while Rebecca and I listened on speaker. A woman answered cautiously, and when Dennis identified himself as a private investigator working on a case involving Yesenia Cortez, she went completely silent for several seconds. Then she asked what this was about, and her voice was shaking. Dennis explained that we needed to speak with her about a marriage certificate from March 2011, that we weren't law enforcement and weren't trying to get her in trouble, but we needed to understand what had happened. Diana's response was immediate and desperate. "I knew this would come back eventually," she said. "I knew it wasn't really over." She agreed to meet with us the following day at a diner in Cleveland. She said she'd been living in fear for 12 years that someone would discover what she'd done and that she'd face consequences. She wanted to tell the truth finally and be done with the constant anxiety. The next morning, Rebecca, Dennis, and I drove 3 hours to Cleveland and met Diana at the diner she'd specified. She was in her early 40s, tired-looking, with the defeated posture of someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. She ordered coffee but didn't drink it, just wrapped her hands around the warm cup while she told us her story. In early 2011, Diana had been desperate for money to pay medical bills for her mother, who'd been dying of cancer. She'd been working 2 jobs, but couldn't keep up with the costs. Someone she knew from her church had approached her with an offer. He said he knew people who paid cash for simple favors, no questions asked. The favor was traveling to Las Vegas for a weekend, signing some paperwork under a different name, and coming home $10,000 richer. Diana had been suspicious but desperate enough to listen. The person explained it was a marriage ceremony, but not a real marriage, just paperwork needed for immigration purposes. He said she'd be marrying a U.S. citizen on paper, but they'd never live together or interact after the ceremony. It was purely a business transaction that helped someone get documentation they needed. Diana had agreed because $10,000 would cover several months of her mother's medical bills, and she'd been out of options. The church contact had given her a passport and identification documents in the name Yesenia Cortez and had driven her to Las Vegas himself. At the chapel, she'd met a man she'd never seen before who was supposedly the groom. He'd barely spoken to her, seemed nervous and uncomfortable, and had signed the marriage certificate quickly before leaving immediately after the ceremony. Diana had been paid in cash and driven back to Ohio. She'd never seen the man again and had tried to forget the whole thing happened. I asked Diana to describe the man she'd married, and her description was startling. He'd been tall, white in his 40s, with graying hair and a professional appearance. That wasn't me. I'd been 21 in 2011, shorter than Diana described, with dark hair and a student's casual clothing. Someone else had stood in that chapel claiming to be me, someone who looked nothing like me. Diana confirmed she'd never met the real person whose name was on the certificate. She'd been told it was all paperwork and immigration documents, that the actual person had given permission for his name to be used. She'd believed the lie because she'd needed to believe it. I asked who had recruited her, who was the church contact who'd arranged everything. Diana hesitated and said she'd been afraid to share that information for 12 years because the person had connections and resources that frightened her. Rebecca assured Diana that anything she told us would be kept confidential until we decided how to proceed legally, and that she'd likely need protection if the person she was about to name was dangerous. Diana took a breath and said the man's name was Michael Strand, that he'd been a prominent member of her church in Columbus, wealthy and respected, someone nobody questioned. Michael had arranged the Las Vegas trip, provided the fake documents, paid Diana in cash, and had warned her never to speak about what had happened. He'd said there were powerful people involved who didn't tolerate mistakes or loose ends. Diana had taken his warning seriously and had kept silent for over a decade. I asked Diana if she knew why Michael had orchestrated this fake marriage, what purpose it served. She said she'd wondered the same thing and had eventually concluded it was part of a larger operation. She'd heard through her church community that other people had taken similar trips to Las Vegas and come back with cash. Always different people, always with Michael's involvement, always told never to discuss it. Diana believed Michael was running an identity fraud ring that used church members as unwitting participants. I felt rage knowing that someone had systematically stolen my identity as part of an organized criminal operation, that Michael Strand had broken into my apartment, stolen my documents, and orchestrated a fake marriage for purposes I still didn't fully understand. Dennis asked Diana if she'd be willing to testify about Michael's involvement, and she said yes, that she'd been waiting for someone to ask her about this for 12 years. Rebecca explained that we'd need to involve law enforcement now because Diana's testimony described organized criminal activity, not just individual fraud. We couldn't pursue this through civil courts alone. Rebecca contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Cleveland and arranged a meeting for that afternoon. The federal agent who met with us was a woman named Catherine Reeves, who specialized in identity theft rings. She listened to Diana's story and reviewed the documents Dennis had compiled. Then she told us something that made the entire case explode into a much larger investigation. The FBI had been tracking Michael Strand for 3 years as part of a task force investigating immigration fraud and identity theft. Michael was suspected of running an operation that created fraudulent marriages to help undocumented immigrants obtain green cards and eventually citizenship. He charged clients $50,000 per marriage and recruited U.S. citizens to participate, either willingly for payment or unwittingly through stolen identities. The FBI estimated Michael had orchestrated over 200 fraudulent marriages between 2009 and 2015 before they'd identified him as a target. They'd been building a case, but had lacked witnesses willing to testify because Michael's threats had been effective. Diana's willingness to cooperate was the breakthrough they needed. Agent Reeves explained that my case fit Michael's pattern perfectly. He'd stolen my identity, created a fake marriage to help an undocumented immigrant named Carlos Mendez obtain legal status, and had used that marriage to facilitate credit fraud as a secondary benefit. The man who'd stood in the chapel claiming to be me had been Carlos, Michael's actual client, who needed the marriage certificate to apply for a green card. Agent Reeves pulled up a photograph of Carlos Mendez from immigration databases, and Diana confirmed he was the man she'd married in Las Vegas. Carlos had used my stolen identity to present himself as a U.S. citizen marrying Diana, who was posing as Yesenia Cortez. The fraudulent marriage had allowed Carlos to apply for permanent residency. His application had been successful, and he'd obtained a green card in 2012, based entirely on the fake marriage certificate. He'd been living in the United States legally for 11 years using documentation obtained through identity theft and fraud. Agent Reeves said Carlos was currently living in Phoenix, working as a contractor, and had no idea the FBI knew about his fraudulent status. They'd been monitoring him as part of the larger investigation into Michael's network. My case provided the specific evidence they needed to arrest both Michael and Carlos and to build charges against everyone involved in the operation. Agent Reeves asked if I'd be willing to cooperate with the federal investigation, to provide testimony and documentation, and to potentially testify at trial. I agreed immediately because I wanted justice and wanted to prevent Michael from victimizing anyone else. Rebecca said we'd continue pursuing the annulment in Nevada while simultaneously supporting the federal case. The two proceedings would complement each other and strengthen both outcomes. Over the following weeks, the investigation moved rapidly. The FBI arrested Michael Strand at his office in Columbus, seizing computers and documents that revealed the full scope of his operation. They found records of 287 fraudulent marriages he'd arranged over a decade, involving stolen identities, paid participants, and undocumented immigrants desperate for legal status. The operation had generated over $14 million in payments to Michael from clients. The FBI also arrested Carlos Mendez in Phoenix and charged him with immigration fraud, identity theft, and making false statements to federal authorities. Carlos's green card was revoked immediately, and he faced deportation proceedings in addition to criminal charges. Diana was offered immunity in exchange for her testimony, and she provided detailed statements about Michael's recruitment methods and the Vegas operation. She also identified other church members who'd participated in similar schemes, giving the FBI additional witnesses. The scope of Michael's crimes was staggering. He'd built a sophisticated operation that exploited vulnerable immigrants while simultaneously victimizing innocent U.S. citizens whose identities were stolen. He'd corrupted the immigration system and profited enormously while leaving dozens of people with damaged credit, legal complications, and stolen identities. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case was a man named David Sterling, who specialized in immigration fraud. He contacted me directly to discuss my role as a victim and witness. Sterling explained that my testimony would be crucial for establishing the harm caused by Michael's operation, that my case demonstrated how identity theft destroyed people's lives in tangible ways. I'd be speaking not just for myself, but for the dozens of other victims whose identities Michael had stolen. The trial was scheduled for 8 months from Michael's arrest. During that time, I focused on untangling my own legal complications. The Nevada annulment hearing proceeded as planned, and the judge granted the annulment immediately after reviewing evidence that the marriage had been fraudulent. The marriage certificate was voided and removed from official records. I was legally free to marry if I chose, though I had no interest in that given the trauma of the past months. My situation with Olivia resolved separately. Her lawyer had negotiated a settlement where I paid her $75,000 for her share of assets we'd accumulated during our time together, even though legally she had no claim. I paid it because it felt morally right, and because I wanted the relationship completely finished. Olivia and I signed the settlement agreement and never spoke again. I also had to address the credit damage from the fraudulent accounts created in 2011. Dennis helped me file disputes with credit bureaus and collection agencies, providing documentation that the accounts were the result of identity theft. The accounts were removed from my credit report, and the defaulted debt was discharged. It took months of paperwork and documentation, but eventually my credit profile was restored to what it should have been without Michael's interference. The criminal trial began in September. Michael Strand faced 87 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit immigration fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, and money laundering. Carlos Mendez faced 12 charges related specifically to his use of my stolen identity. Diana testified first, describing how Michael had recruited her and dozens of others from their church community. She explained Michael's methods of targeting people in financial distress and exploiting their desperation. She described the Vegas operation and how Michael had made participants believe they were helping people rather than committing crimes. Her testimony was powerful and credible, and I watched the jury's expressions shift from skepticism to disgust as they understood the scope of Michael's manipulation. I testified on the 4th day of trial. Sterling walked me through discovering the fraudulent marriage, the investigation that followed, and the impact on my life. I described the violation of having my identity stolen, the months of legal complications, the destroyed marriage to Olivia, and the ongoing fear that other aspects of my identity might have been compromised. I explained how Michael's crimes had stolen not just information, but security and peace of mind. Under cross-examination, Michael's defense attorney tried to suggest I'd been negligent in protecting my personal information, that I'd somehow enabled the theft. Sterling objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most objections, but the defense attorney's questions still implied I bore some responsibility. I kept my composure and responded factually, explaining that I'd been a 21-year-old college student living normal life when Michael's criminal operation targeted me. The trial lasted 3 weeks and included testimony from 14 different victims whose identities Michael had stolen, from immigrants who'd paid him for fraudulent marriages, and from federal agents who'd investigated the operation. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for Michael. Carlos was convicted on 11 of his 12 charges, with 1 count dismissed on a technicality. At sentencing 2 months later, the judge condemned Michael's crimes as a systematic exploitation of vulnerable people on both sides of the immigration process. Michael was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.4 million in restitution to victims. Carlos received 8 years and would be deported after serving his sentence. The judge made specific mention of my case during sentencing, noting that Michael's crimes had destroyed marriages, damaged credit, and created legal nightmares for innocent people. The acknowledgement felt validating after months of feeling like a victim of forces beyond my control. After the sentencing, Agent Reeves told me the investigation had expanded to identify other members of Michael's network who'd helped facilitate the operation. She said my willingness to come forward and cooperate had been essential to dismantling an organization that would have continued victimizing people for years. I thanked her and Diana and everyone who'd helped bring Michael to justice. Then I went home to my apartment and tried to rebuild a life that had been derailed by a crime I hadn't known about for 8 years. The aftermath took time to process. I'd learned that identity theft wasn't just financial crime, but a violation that affected every aspect of life. Someone had literally signed my name to a marriage certificate, had used my identity to build a fraudulent life, had created legal complications that had destroyed my actual marriage. The psychological impact was significant, and I started therapy to address the anxiety and violation I felt. My therapist helped me understand that what I'd experienced was a form of abuse, that Michael had stolen not just information, but autonomy and security. Recovery meant reclaiming control over my identity and my narrative. I changed all my passwords, set up comprehensive identity monitoring, and became vigilant about protecting personal information. I also became an advocate for identity theft victims, speaking at community events about my experience and encouraging people to take protection seriously. 2 years after Michael's conviction, I received a letter from Carlos Mendez. He was writing from federal prison and wanted to apologize for his role in stealing my identity. He explained that he'd been desperate when he'd paid Michael, that he'd been working illegally for years and had wanted legal status to support his family. He said he hadn't understood that using my identity meant destroying someone else's life. He'd thought it was just paperwork that wouldn't affect anyone. His apology felt genuine, but insufficient. His desperation didn't excuse the harm he'd caused, and I chose not to respond to his letter. Some apologies can't fix what was broken. 3 years after the trial, I met someone named Claire, who I eventually married after carefully verifying that no fraudulent prior marriages existed. We had a small ceremony attended by close friends and family, and I made sure every document was legitimate and properly recorded. The wedding felt like reclaiming something Michael had stolen, proving that his crimes hadn't permanently damaged my ability to trust and connect. Claire knew my history and understood why I was cautious about legal documents and identity verification. She never made me feel paranoid for double-checking everything. Today, I work as a fraud prevention consultant helping organizations identify and prevent identity theft. Michael's operation taught me how vulnerable our systems are and how easily criminals can exploit gaps in verification processes. I use that knowledge to help protect others from experiencing what I went through. Michael remains in federal prison and will be there until he's in his 70s. Carlos was deported to Mexico after serving his sentence. Diana rebuilt her life after testifying and has become an advocate for protecting vulnerable communities from exploitation. The church where Michael recruited victims closed its doors after the scandal destroyed its reputation and membership. Several hundred people discovered their identities had been compromised by Michael's operation, and most are still working to repair the damage years later. Justice was served, but recovery continues. The system that failed to detect a fraudulent marriage for 8 years has since improved verification processes, making it harder for criminals to exploit gaps in record-keeping. My case became a catalyst for reform, turning personal violation into systemic change that protects others. That transformation doesn't erase what was taken from me, but it gives meaning to the suffering and ensures Michael's victims weren't harmed for nothing. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.